Hey, so I want to follow up on something I very briefly said in a previous video about mixins, that you might be able to move away from SASS mixins using more modern CSS properties, possibly. So I just want to kind of find a use case to walk that through. I should clarify straight away, it's not to say that there's any problem with SASS or that it's outdated or defunct or there's some reason you need to move away from it. If it still works for you, that's fine. Also, not to suggest that everything you can do in SASS can now be done in regular CSS. It can't. It still has all these incredible functional benefits of loops and if statements and programmatic things that let you build stuff. But there's just there's always a problem there that you're writing in something which eventually becomes CSS. The further you get away in terms of abstractions, the less you're aware of what you're actually generating. So in that example of creating some sort of loop that's going to create a class for 1 to 10 elements, you're writing one small function, but what CSS you actually spit out is massive because of you're not perhaps aware of what the visual output is of that CSS. Any scenario in which you're able to move more close to the realistic CSS that's eventually used, the more beneficial, I think, to your own mental constructs. So I'm going to walk through this example here. We've got 3 little blocks of text, all with demo box and then a class that just distinguishes their color. That gives them different backgrounds, a different colored icon, different text, and we're using SASS extensively. So we're using these SASS variables to set the colors. We've got a little mix-in that creates a background color, a fill color, a color for the text. It's going to kind of group common settings based on a color variable. We've got a text overflow mix-in, which just groups these 3 settings together. And we've got a little padding box, which means you give it a value and it just multiplies that by 5 on the padding. And that means down here on the demo box, we can say, yeah, we want pad 5, and we also want each one to have its own color function. And then on the paragraph text, we're going to add our little text overflow grouping. So there we've got a few common use cases of SASS. We're kind of grouping up functionality. We are making things dynamic, making things pass variables, meaning you can reuse the same logic over and over. Can we do something similar but not using mixins? So the difficult thing straight away is that you would have to move to more of a utility class-based setup, because rather than chaining all things together here, you'd have to define things in separate properties and then define that on the HTML, which might be a convention you wouldn't want to shift to. So here with the text overflow mixin, you could instead obviously make a class called text overflow and then apply that to our demo box. There we go, and you've still got the text doing its nice ellipse overflow there. So that's obviously not even much modern CSS. You're just changing to be a slightly utility-based system where instead you're going to group functionality into little classes and then chain them on in a very kind of Tailwind-style utility CSS situation. With something here like this padding box, you could, again, let's make a pad box like this. And this is going to set the padding to be a calc of a variable called padding multiplied by 5 pixels. So here we're just doing the same sort of logic. You're going to duplicate, instead of a dynamic variable you receive, you're going to just use a custom property of padding and multiply it by 5 pixels to generate the same thing. So I'm going to define that at the top to be by default 0. Text overflow 1. Pad box on here. Pad box on here. Pad box on here. We're going to take this one off, as well as the text overflow while we're here. So here we've lost our padding. On demo box, if we now just define our padding here to be 5, we're doing the same basic logic, because it means within the scope of the demo box class, padding is going to be 5, and because that's also combined with the pad box class up here, it's then going to times that by the 5 pixels and do the exact same logic as it was before in creating a function. So you are able to make a class and then make it a reusable setting that can also be dynamic. So throughout your application, you could just find wherever you need padding to be applied to an element. If you always want it to be a multiplier of a common unit, you could always just apply your padding class where you need, and then within that scoped element, just redefine your variable, just set it to how many units you need. So you can somewhat create a functional-like aspect. With regard to the colors, so up here we've got this block. So let's instead do a class called like ColorBox. What we want here is each color is going to have its own background. So even though we're going to give this ColorBox class to each one, so I'll do that again. ColorBox 1, ColorBox 2, ColorBox 3. We don't necessarily want to scope that and define it in one way. So I guess these up here should all become variables in the same way. So we should go primary, secondary, warning, like that. But obviously if we make that one specific color like this, then we're just defining it to the one color there. So instead we're going to have to create our own variable like this that's just going to exist within ColorBox, and that's going to have a background of color, and then let's just do the same for color, and then fill for the SVG. So that's going to do nothing there. Just adding an extra few settings on here. So for the paragraph text, it's going to have the same color and background as whatever's given to it. So on the paragraph text, I'm just going to also up the brightness so that the color is not exactly, otherwise it'd be invisible. So it's going to be slightly brighter than its background, but it's still going to carry the same hue. So it's going to be nicely scoped to whatever the color box is in. Similar to the SVG, it's going to be slightly brighter and have a saturation filter. So it means that you only need to provide one color to the color box, and that way it should inherently be able to pass down rules to any paragraph tags and SVGs to know that you should be a slight variation on the color that you're given, and that way they should be nicely scoped. So I've added the color box to all three of these. I should be able to now go for one, instead of this mix-in, I should be able to just define the color variable to be primary. Let's see, like so. Boom, there you go. So it instantly knows that the background should be the green color. The text should also be the green color, but with a different brightness setting. The SVG should have a slightly different setting. So theoretically now, instead of adding this mix-in on each one, I should be able to just give it a variable. Warning. There we go. So we've been able to now make it that these little boxes at low level only carry any distinguishing aspects, anything that make them different from the others, which is to be like what your distinguishing color is going to be. And because of all the base settings we've set higher up, it's going to have the common settings for a demo box, including what padding setting. The padding box setting knows what to do with the calculations there. The text overflow is just grouped and can be added as needed on these boxes. And then there's these color box settings, which are going to just share whatever the common color is and apply some various settings based on the scoping. So this could be, you could decide this is really messy. You basically just separate everything out into lots of low-level classes. But I think it means you've got some computation, meaning you're able to share common sets of settings, and you're able to pass down settings as needed to kind of gain all the leverage without having to rewrite the class over and over and duplicate your CSS. This literally won't duplicate. If you did this in SASS, it will basically, when it goes to generate the CSS, it will basically just make loads of variations and loads of classes. This one, you are just writing low-level classes, but you're just slightly tweaking all the settings, and it's still very composable. So this is using pad box, but if on just number 2 for some reason I wanted to have slightly more padding, I could theoretically increase it. And that way I'm not having to write more CSS or more classes. I'm able to use these custom properties as tweaks and settings about low-level properties. The only situation is here I'm just grouping lots of things and just appending loads of classes on together. So where you start overwriting those settings could be in different places, and that could get quite hard to follow. But I think as long as you apply this as part of a strategy, the main reason I got this example together is just that if you are using like 1 or 2 mixins throughout your whole code base, it might be quite easy to refactor those into regular CSS classes with a few custom properties, and you can move away from SASS entirely, which again is not necessarily a problem to be using it, but you would be able to reduce your build process, reduce the size of your CSS, make your whole workflow slightly more manageable if it's really not offering you massive advantage. But if it's much more convoluted, if you have all kinds of loops and if logic and things that are going to be harder to unpick, then you're probably best staying with SASS for now. That's all on this one. Any comments, feedback, always good, but otherwise, have a lovely day.